The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days straight, turning the usually vibrant streets of Millbrook Heights into a collection of gray puddles and soggy lawns. From my kitchen window, I watched the water cascade down the gutters, creating small rivers that rushed toward the storm drains at the end of our cul-de-sac. It was the kind of weather that made you want to stay inside with a warm cup of coffee and a good book. But life doesn't pause for rainy days. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I had been living at 847 Maple Grove Drive for exactly 18 months, and in all that time, I'd barely exchanged more than polite nods with most of my neighbors. There was Mrs. Patterson from next door, who always seemed to be pruning her roses at precisely the moment I left for work. The Hendricks family across the street kept to themselves, their teenage kids disappearing into cars that would screech away from the curb. And then there was the house directly to my left, number 843, where someone lived alone but rarely seemed to venture outside. That someone was Rebecca Martinez, though I didn't learn her name until much later. For months, she had been nothing more than glimpses through windows, shadows moving behind curtains, and the occasional sound of her car starting early in the morning. The house itself told a story of recent change. The garden beds were overgrown. With weeds, paint was peeling from the front porch railings, and newspapers had a habit of piling up by the front door during weekends. It wasn't neglect exactly. More like someone who was overwhelmed by the simple act of maintaining appearances. On that particular Tuesday morning, as I stood at my kitchen sink washing the breakfast dishes, I noticed movement in Rebecca's backyard. She was standing near what had once been a vegetable garden, now nothing more than a patch of brown earth dotted with the skeletal remains of tomato plants from the previous summer. She wore a faded blue raincoat that was clearly too large for her frame, and her gray-streaked hair was pulled back into a practical ponytail that had seen better days. What struck me most wasn't her appearance, but the way she stood there, completely motionless, staring at that dead garden as if it held answers to questions she couldn't quite formulate. There was something profoundly lonely about the scene. The kind of loneliness that settles into your bones and changes the way you move through the world. I found myself watching longer than I should have, feeling like an intruder in a private moment of reflection. Rebecca had moved into the neighborhood sometime during the previous autumn, when the leaves were turning and there was still warmth in the afternoon sun. The moving truck had arrived on a Saturday morning, and I remembered thinking it was unusual to see only one person directing the movers. No family members helping, no friends carrying boxes, just Rebecca standing on the front porch with a clipboard, checking items off a list with the methodical precision of someone who had learned to rely entirely on themselves. The house had been empty for nearly 6 months before she arrived. The previous owners, an elderly couple named the Kowalskis, had lived there for 43 years before moving to a retirement community in Florida. They had been the kind of neighbors who knew everyone's names, who organized block parties and kept spare keys for emergencies. Their departure had left a noticeable void in the social fabric of our small street, and Rebecca's arrival hadn't filled that void so much as highlighted it. In the weeks following her move, I had occasionally seen delivery trucks pulling up to her house. Grocery deliveries, packages from online retailers, and once, a truck from a local furniture store. She seemed to be building a life from scratch, piece by piece, but always alone. There were no visitors, no friends stopping by to help with unpacking, no family members checking in on how she was settling into her new home. The few times our paths had crossed, our interactions had been brief but polite. A wave when we both happened to be checking our mailboxes. A quick good morning when I was leaving for work and she was bringing in her garbage cans. She had a voice that carried traces of warmth buried beneath layers of caution. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who had been hurt before and wasn't eager to risk it again. I had learned fragments of her story through the neighborhood. Grapevine, which in Millbrook Heights was primarily fueled by Mrs. Patterson's conversations with the mail carrier and her weekly coffee meetings with other longtime residents. Rebecca was recently divorced, though the details remained vague. She had moved here from somewhere in Colorado, leaving behind what Mrs. Patterson described as a whole different life. She worked remotely for some kind of consulting firm, which explained why her car rarely left the driveway during typical business hours. As I watched her standing in the rain that Tuesday morning, I realized that 18 months of polite distance had created a strange sort of familiarity. I knew her routines without knowing her story. I knew she ordered Thai food every Friday night, that she received flowers delivered to her door on the 15th of every month, and that she sometimes sat on her front porch in the evenings with a glass of wine, staring at nothing in particular. But I didn't know why she looked so lost, or what had brought her to our quiet street, or whether she was happy with the new life she was trying to build. The rain was getting heavier, and I watched as Rebecca finally turned away from the dead garden and walked back toward her house. She moved with the careful steps of someone who had learned not to hurry, not to expect too much from any given day. As she reached her back door, she paused and looked in my direction. For a moment, I thought she had seen me watching through the window, and I felt a flush of embarrassment at being caught in my unintentional surveillance. But she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at my house, or perhaps beyond it, with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger or curiosity, but something more complex. It was the look of someone who was weighing possibilities, considering options, trying to decide whether to take a step that couldn't be taken back. That afternoon, as I was working from my home office, I heard an unfamiliar sound. Someone was knocking on my front door. It wasn't the confident rap of a delivery person or the perfunctory knock of a solicitor. It was hesitant, uncertain, the kind of knocking that suggested the person on the other side was already regretting their decision to approach. I made my way to the front door and looked through the peephole. Rebecca was standing on my front porch, no longer wearing the oversized raincoat. Instead, she had on a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, and her hair was down around her shoulders, still damp from the rain. She was holding a small plate covered with aluminum foil, and her expression was a mixture of determination and anxiety. When I opened the door, she seemed momentarily surprised, as if she hadn't expected me to actually answer. We stood there, for a few seconds, two neighbors who had shared proximity but never conversation, suddenly face to face with the prospect of actual human interaction. "Hi," she said, and her voice was quieter than I remembered. "I'm Rebecca, from next door. I know we haven't really met properly, and I hope I'm not bothering you." I assured her she wasn't bothering me, and she seemed to relax slightly. She lifted the plate and explained that she had made too much banana bread and thought I might like some. It was the kind of gesture that belonged to a different era, when neighbors knew each other's names and borrowed cups of sugar, but it felt genuine rather than calculated. As I accepted the plate and thanked her, I noticed that her hands were shaking slightly, not from cold, but from nervousness. Whatever had prompted this visit, it was taking considerable courage for her to be standing on my doorstep. "Would you like to come in for a minute?" I asked, and immediately saw relief flash across her face. "I don't want to impose," she said, but she was already stepping inside before I could insist that she wasn't imposing at all. My living room suddenly felt smaller with another person in it, but not uncomfortably so. Rebecca looked around with the careful attention of someone who was genuinely interested in how other people lived their lives. She noticed the books stacked on my coffee table, the photographs on the mantelpiece, the way the afternoon light fell through the windows. "You have a nice place," she said, settling into the chair I offered her. "Very lived in. Comfortable." There was something wistful in the way she said it, as if comfort was something she was still learning to recognize. I offered her coffee, which she accepted gratefully, and as I went to the kitchen to prepare it, I could hear her moving around the living room, not touching anything but taking in the details that make a house feel like a home. When I returned, with two steaming mugs, Rebecca was standing by the window that looked out toward her house. From this angle, you could see the full extent of the work that needed to be done. The gutters were clogged with leaves, the front steps had loose boards, and the lawn was more weeds than grass. "I keep meaning to hire someone to help with all that," she said, gesturing vaguely toward her property. "But it's hard to know where to start, you know? Everything seems to need attention at once." I understood that feeling. There had been a time in my own life when basic maintenance had felt overwhelming, when the simple act of making decisions about home repairs had seemed impossibly complex. It was the kind of paralysis that came from having too many changes happen, all at once. We sat down with our coffee, and for a few minutes we talked about safe topics: the weather, the neighborhood, the best places to shop for groceries. But I could sense that there was something else she wanted to discuss, something that had actually motivated her to bake banana bread and knock on my door. Finally, after a particularly long pause in our conversation, Rebecca set down her coffee mug and looked directly at me. Her expression had changed, becoming more serious, more vulnerable. "Can I ask you something?" she said. And there was something in her tone that suggested this question was the real reason for her visit. I told her she could ask me anything, and she took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "Would you date someone who's 54 and starting over?" The question hung in the air between us, unexpected and loaded with implications I wasn't prepared to navigate. It wasn't the kind of question you ask a neighbor you barely know, unless you're desperate for an honest answer from someone who doesn't have a vested interest in making you feel better. Rebecca's cheeks had turned slightly pink, but she maintained eye contact, waiting for my response. I realized that this wasn't a casual question born of idle curiosity. This was someone who was genuinely struggling with fundamental questions about her worth, her prospects, her ability to build something new from the ruins of whatever had come before. "That's a very specific question," I said carefully, buying myself time to think. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I know," she replied. "I'm sorry if it's too personal. I haven't talked to anyone in a long time. Really talked, I mean. And sometimes you need to hear things from someone who doesn't know your whole story." There was something heartbreaking about the way she said it, the acknowledgement that she had been living in such isolation that a virtual stranger felt like her best option for honest conversation. I found myself wondering how long it had been since she'd had a friend to call, someone who cared about her happiness for its own sake. "Why 54 specifically?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Rebecca smiled, but it was a sad smile, the kind that acknowledged pain rather than hiding from it. "Because that's how old I am. And because 6 months ago, my husband of 28 years told me he was leaving me for someone 20 years younger. And because I have no idea how to be alone, let alone how to even think about being with someone new." The words came out in a rush, as if she had been holding them back for so long that they couldn't be contained anymore. She immediately looked embarrassed, as if she couldn't believe she had shared something so personal with someone she barely knew. But I was glad she had. For the first time since I'd been watching her through windows and across lawns, Rebecca felt like a real person rather than a mystery. Her loneliness made sense now, as did the overwhelming nature of basic home maintenance and the careful way she moved through the world. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I don't know why I told you all that. You probably think I'm crazy, coming over here and dumping my problems on you." I assured her that I didn't think she was crazy, and that I was honored. She felt comfortable enough to share something so difficult. The truth was, her question had stirred up thoughts I'd been avoiding about my own life, my own fears about starting over, my own uncertainties about what it meant to build something meaningful with another person. "To answer your question," I said slowly, "I think 54 and starting over sounds like someone who has lived enough to know what matters and is brave enough to try again." Rebecca looked at me with surprise, as if she hadn't expected such a direct and positive response. "Really? Really? But I have a feeling that's not the answer you've been giving yourself." She laughed, but it was a laugh that contained more pain than humor. "No, it's definitely not. I keep thinking about everything I don't know how to do anymore. I was married for so long that I forgot how to be interesting to someone new. I don't know how to flirt or date or any of those things people are supposed to know how to do." As she spoke, I began to understand that Rebecca's question wasn't really about whether someone her age could find love again. It was about whether she was worth loving, whether the experiences that had shaped her had made her more valuable or less valuable in the marketplace of human connection. "Have you thought about trying?" I asked. "Dating?" She shook her head. "I wouldn't even know where to begin. And honestly, the idea terrifies me. What if I'm too set in my ways? What if I'm too damaged? What if I've forgotten how to be the kind of person someone could fall in love with?" The vulnerability in her voice was unmistakable. Here was someone who had built her identity around being part of a couple for nearly 3 decades, and now found herself adrift in a world that seemed designed for people who were either much younger or much more confident than she felt. But there was something else in her voice too, something that gave me hope for her. Despite her fears and her uncertainty, Rebecca was asking the right questions. She wasn't retreating from the possibility of love. She was trying to figure out how to move toward it. She wasn't giving up. She was gathering information. "Can I tell you something?" I said, and she nodded. The fact that you're asking these questions, the fact that you're thinking about what it would mean to try again, that tells me you're not too damaged or too set in your ways. That tells me you're still growing. Rebecca considered this, turning her coffee mug in her hands as she thought. My therapist says something similar. She keeps telling me that my marriage ending doesn't mean I failed as a person, just that I need to figure out who I am when I'm not defined by being someone's wife. The mention of therapy was another piece of the puzzle. Rebecca wasn't just passively accepting her situation. She was actively working to understand it, to heal from it, to prepare herself for whatever came next. That took courage and self-awareness that many people never developed, regardless of their age. That sounds like a smart therapist, I said. She is. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two very different things, you know? In my head, I understand that I have value as an individual. But in my heart, I still feel like damaged goods. The honesty was stunning. Here was someone who was willing to examine her own pain with clear eyes, to acknowledge her fears without being paralyzed by them. It struck me that whatever man had been foolish enough to leave Rebecca for someone younger had given up something precious without even realizing it. As the afternoon stretched on, our conversation deepened. Rebecca told me about her marriage, how it had started with such promise and gradually eroded into something that looked functional from the outside but felt empty from within. She talked about the signs she had ignored, the compromises she had made, the way she had slowly lost herself in the process of trying to save something that was already lost. But she also talked about the unexpected freedoms that had come with starting over. The ability to eat dinner whenever she wanted, to decorate her house according to her own tastes, to make decisions without consulting anyone else. These were small things, but they represented a kind of autonomy she hadn't experienced since she was in her 20s. Sometimes I wake up in the morning and for just a moment I forget that everything has changed, she said. And then I remember, and it's like losing him all over again. But other times, I wake up and realize that I can do whatever I want with my day, and that feels like a kind of magic I'd forgotten existed. As the light outside began to fade, Rebecca glanced at her watch and looked surprised at how much time had passed. I should probably let you get back to your day, she said, but she made no move to get up from her chair. You don't have to go, I said, unless you have somewhere else you need to be. She smiled, and this time it was a genuine smile, one that reached her eyes. No, I don't have anywhere else to be. That's both the blessing and the curse of starting over. Complete freedom can be just as overwhelming as no freedom at all. As the evening settled around us, I realized that something important had shifted. Rebecca was no longer the mysterious neighbor who lived alone next door. She was becoming a real person with a real story. Someone whose struggles and hopes were beginning to matter to me in ways I hadn't anticipated. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice was beginning to whisper that maybe, just maybe, the answer to her question about dating someone who was 54 and starting over was sitting right across from her, wondering the same thing about himself. The following weekend brought an unexpected warmth to Millbrook Heights, one of those early spring days when winter suddenly loosens its grip and the world remembers what sunshine feels like. I was in my garage, finally tackling the project I'd been avoiding for months, organizing the chaos of tools, holiday decorations, and miscellaneous items that had accumulated since my own move to the neighborhood 2 years earlier. The sound of hammering from next door caught my attention around 10 in the morning. Through the small window that faced Rebecca's backyard, I could see her kneeling beside what appeared to be the skeletal frame of a raised garden bed. She was wearing work gloves that looked brand new and wielding a hammer with the determined awkwardness of someone who was learning as she went. What struck me most wasn't her obvious inexperience with carpentry, but the sheer persistence with which she approached each task. When a board wouldn't align properly, she didn't throw down her tools in frustration. Instead, she would step back, study the problem from different angles, and try again. There was something admirable about her methodical approach, the way she refused to be defeated by unfamiliar challenges. Our conversation from earlier in the week had been replaying in my mind ever since. The vulnerability she had shown, the honest way she had articulated fears that most people keep buried, had created an unexpected connection between us. I found myself thinking about her question at odd moments, while making coffee in the morning, during conference calls for work, as I fell asleep at night. Would you date someone who's 54 and starting over? The question had lodged itself in my consciousness not just because of its directness, but because it had forced me to examine my own assumptions about age, relationships, and second chances. At 38, I had my own collection of failed relationships and fresh starts. The idea that someone 16 years older might be grappling with similar uncertainties about love and connection hadn't occurred to me before. But now it seemed obvious. Around noon, I heard a string of creative curse words floating over the fence, followed by the sound of tools being dropped onto concrete. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked to the edge of my property where I could see into Rebecca's yard more clearly. Each time I felt a small jolt of awareness, a recognition that something was shifting between us that went beyond neighborly cooperation. Around 4 o'clock, we stepped back to admire our completed garden bed. It was roughly 4 feet by 8 feet, raised about 18 inches off the ground, and solid enough to last for years. Rebecca ran her hands along the smooth wooden edges with obvious satisfaction. "I can't believe we actually built something," she said. "Something real and functional and permanent." The word permanent seemed to hang in the air between us, loaded with meanings that extended far beyond garden construction. For someone who was rebuilding her entire life from scratch, the idea of creating something that would last must have carried special significance. "What are you going to plant?" I asked. "Everything," she said immediately, then laughed at her own enthusiasm. "Tomatoes, definitely. And herbs, basil, oregano, thyme, maybe some peppers. I've been reading about companion planting, where certain vegetables help each other grow better when they're planted together." She was practically glowing as she talked about her plans, and I realized this was the first time I had seen her look genuinely excited about anything. The contrast with the lonely, uncertain woman who had knocked on my door a few days earlier was striking. "It sounds like you've done your research," I said. "Too much research, probably. I have 3 different gardening books, and I've watched approximately 47 YouTube videos on soil composition." She paused, looking slightly embarrassed. "I tend to overthink things when I'm nervous about them." "What makes you nervous about gardening?" Rebecca was quiet for a moment, brushing dirt off her gloves. "I guess I'm afraid I'll kill everything. That I'll prove I'm not capable of nurturing something and helping it grow." The vulnerability in her voice told me we weren't really talking about plants anymore. I found myself wanting to reassure her, to tell her that her capacity for care and growth was evident in everything from the way she had asked for help to the determination she had shown in rebuilding this garden bed. But instead, I simply said, "Plants are more resilient than you think, and mistakes are part of the learning process." As we cleaned up our tools, Rebecca surprised me by asking if I had dinner plans. "I was thinking of ordering pizza," she said, "to celebrate our construction victory. You're welcome to stay, if you don't have somewhere else to be." The invitation felt significant, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Maybe it was the casualness of it, the assumption that I might want to extend our time together. Or maybe it was the way she asked, as if the possibility of my saying yes mattered to her. "Pizza sounds perfect," I said. An hour later, we were sitting on Rebecca's back porch, sharing a large pizza with more toppings than either of us could possibly finish, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. The conversation had moved away from gardening and construction toward more personal territory. "Can I ask you something?" Rebecca said, echoing the words that had started our first real conversation a few days earlier. "Of course. Why aren't you married? Or dating someone seriously? You seem like the kind of person who would be good at relationships." The question caught me off guard, partly because I hadn't expected her to turn the tables on personal inquiries, and partly because I wasn't sure I had a good answer. "That's complicated," I said finally. "Most honest answers are," she replied, settling back in her chair with obvious patience. I found myself telling Rebecca about my last serious relationship, which had ended almost 2 years earlier. Sarah and I had been together for 3 years, living together for 1, when we realized we wanted fundamentally different things from life. She wanted marriage, children, a house in the suburbs with a 2-car garage and a retirement plan. I wanted, well, I had never been entirely sure what I wanted, which had been part of the problem. "She wasn't wrong to want those things," I explained. "They're good things, important things. But every time she talked about our future, I felt like I was suffocating. Not because I didn't care about her, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that we were planning someone else's life. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. What did you want instead? I think I wanted the freedom to figure it out as I went along, to make decisions based on what felt right in the moment rather than what looked right on paper. I paused, realizing how that might sound. Which probably makes me sound like I'm afraid of commitment. Or like you're honest about not wanting to commit to the wrong things for the wrong reasons, Rebecca said. There's a difference. Her perspective surprised me. I had expected judgment, or at least the kind of gentle criticism that suggested I needed to grow up and accept adult responsibilities. Instead, she seemed to understand the distinction between avoiding commitment and refusing to commit to something that didn't feel authentic. Is that what happened in your marriage? I asked. Committing to the wrong things? Rebecca was quiet, for a long time, staring out at her newly constructed garden bed, as if it held answers to questions she was still learning to ask. I think I committed to the right things for the wrong reasons, she said eventually. I wanted security, stability, the sense that my life was following a predictable path, and David provided all of that. But somewhere along the way, I stopped asking whether it was making me happy. When did you realize it wasn't? Honestly. Not until he left, which is pathetic when you think about it. I was so focused on maintaining what we had built that I never stopped to examine whether it was worth maintaining. The honesty in her voice was remarkable. Here was someone who was willing to acknowledge her own role in the failure of her marriage, without either taking all the blame or deflecting it entirely onto her ex-husband. It suggested a level of self-awareness that I found both attractive and slightly intimidating. What would you do differently now? I asked. Rebecca smiled, but it was a thoughtful smile rather than a sad one. I think I would pay more attention to how things feel rather than how they look. I spent so many years focused on whether our marriage appeared successful that I forgot to notice whether it actually felt fulfilling. As the evening deepened and the temperature began to drop, we moved our conversation inside. Rebecca's house was smaller than mine, but decorated with obvious care. The walls were painted in warm, earthy colors, and every room contained small touches that spoke to her personality. Books stacked on every available surface, plants thriving in sunny corners, photographs from travels to places I couldn't identify. This is beautiful, I said, genuinely impressed by how she had transformed what I remembered as the Kowalskis' rather generic interior into something that felt distinctly like home. Thank you. It's the first place that's ever been entirely mine. Every decision, from the paint colors to the furniture placement, was mine to make. It's liberating and terrifying at the same time. We settled into her living room with glasses of wine, and the conversation took on the easy intimacy that comes when two people discover they enjoy each other's company. Rebecca told me about her work as a consultant for nonprofit organizations, helping them develop more effective fundraising strategies. It was work she had started during the final years of her marriage, when she realized she needed something that belonged entirely to her. David never understood why I wanted to work, she said. We didn't need the money, and he thought it was unnecessary stress. But it wasn't about the money. It was about having something that existed because of my efforts, my skills, my value, as an individual rather than as half of a couple. I found myself admiring not just her independence, but the thoughtful way she had approached rebuilding her professional identity. She hadn't simply fallen into a job. She had chosen work that aligned with her values and utilized skills she had developed through years of volunteer experience. Do you like it? I asked. I love it, she said without hesitation. For the first time in my adult life, I feel genuinely useful, not just helpful or supportive, but actually essential to something important. As the night grew later, I found myself reluctant to leave. Our conversation had meandered through topics both serious and lighthearted, and I was struck by how easy it was to talk with Rebecca. She was thoughtful without being overly analytical, funny without trying too hard, and honest in a way that made me want to be equally honest in return. When I finally looked at my watch, I was shocked to discover it was nearly midnight. I should probably head home, I said, though every part of me wanted to find an excuse to stay longer. Thank you, Rebecca said as she walked me to the door. For helping with the garden bed, for staying for dinner, for making me feel less alone. The gratitude in her voice was so genuine that it made something tighten in my chest. As I walked back to my own house, I realized that our afternoon of construction and evening of conversation had shifted something fundamental between us. We were no longer just neighbors who happened to live next door to each other. We were becoming friends and possibly something more. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and replaying moments from our day together, I couldn't shake the memory of Rebecca's original question. Would you date someone who's 54 and starting over? The question felt more relevant now, more personal, because I was beginning to realize that my answer might matter more than either of us had anticipated. 3 weeks had passed since the garden bed construction, and what had started as neighborly assistance had evolved into something neither Rebecca nor I had quite named yet. Our interactions had become a natural part of daily life. Morning waves that lingered longer than necessary, impromptu conversations over the fence while checking mail, shared cups of coffee that stretched into lengthy discussions about everything, from local politics to favorite books. On this particular Thursday morning, I was running late for an important client presentation when I noticed Rebecca's car still in her driveway. This was unusual. She typically left for her monthly in-person meeting with her biggest client before 8, and it was already past 9. As I loaded my laptop bag into my car, I caught sight of her sitting on her front steps, still in her pajamas, staring at her phone with an expression of complete bewilderment. My presentation could wait 5 minutes. I walked over to her front yard, noting that she looked smaller somehow, as if the confidence she had been building over the past few weeks had suddenly evaporated. "Everything okay?" I asked, and she looked up with eyes that were clearly fighting. Back tears. "My client just fired me," she said, her voice flat with shock. "Via email. After 18 months of working together, after all the progress we've made, they decided to go with a larger firm. Apparently they need someone with more extensive corporate experience." The words came out in a rush, followed by a bitter laugh that contained no humor whatsoever. The funny thing is, I helped them increase their fundraising by 60% last year. But apparently that doesn't matter as much as having the right pedigree. I sat down on the step beside her, not sure what to say. This client had represented nearly 40% of Rebecca's income, and more importantly, it had been validation that she could succeed as an independent professional. Losing it was more than a financial setback. It was a direct challenge to the new identity she had been working so hard to build. "Did they give you any notice?" I asked. 2 weeks, which is generous, considering they could have terminated the contract immediately. She scrolled through the email again, as if rereading it might change the content. "The project manager actually had the audacity to say they hoped we could work together again in the future. As if this isn't a complete rejection of everything I've contributed." The anger in her voice was healthier than the shock, but I could see that underneath both emotions was a deeper fear. This setback was threatening to confirm every doubt she had harbored about her ability to succeed on her own. "What are you going to do?" I asked. Rebecca shrugged, and the gesture made her look younger and more vulnerable than her 54 years. "I honestly don't know. I have 2 smaller clients, but they don't pay enough to cover my basic expenses. I've been living on savings for the past few months, thinking this contract would give me the stability to really build something sustainable." She stood up abruptly, pacing to the edge of her porch. Maybe David was right. Maybe I was fooling myself thinking I could make this work. Maybe I should have just found another corporate job instead of trying to prove I could be independent. The mention of her ex-husband's name in this context made something protective flare up in my chest. "Don't do that," I said more sharply than I intended. Rebecca turned to look at me, surprised by my tone. "Don't let one client's short-sighted decision make you question everything you've accomplished," I continued. "You didn't fail at anything. They failed to recognize value when they had it." "But what if this is a pattern? What if I keep losing clients because I don't have the right credentials or connections or whatever it is that real consultants have?" The self-doubt in her voice was painful to hear, especially because I had watched her confidence grow over the past few weeks. She had been blossoming, finding her footing in this new life, and now one email had threatened to undo all that progress. "Rebecca," I said, standing up to face her directly. 3 weeks ago, you were afraid you couldn't nurture anything and help it grow, but you built a garden bed from scratch, and yesterday, you were showing me the first seedlings sprouting from the soil. You learned something completely new and succeeded at it. She opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand. You've increased multiple clients' fundraising success. You've built a business from nothing while rebuilding your entire life. You've created a home that feels more warm and welcoming than most places I've ever been. None of that changes because one organization made a decision based on politics rather than performance. Rebecca stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her processing my words, weighing them against the harsh voice of self-criticism that had clearly been amplified by this morning's news. You really believe that? She asked quietly. I believe in you, I said, and the words came out with more conviction than I had expected. More than that, I've seen the evidence. You're not the same person who knocked on my door a month ago asking whether someone your age could start over. You've already started over. You're already succeeding. Something shifted in Rebecca's expression, and for the first time since I had found her on the steps, she looked like herself again. Not completely recovered, but no longer drowning in self-doubt. I need to call my other clients, she said, her voice steadier now. Let them know I'll have more availability. See if they have additional projects or know anyone who might need consulting services. That sounds like a plan, I said, proud of how quickly she had moved from despair to action. And I should probably shower and get dressed, she added, looking down at her pajamas with a slight smile. Professional phone calls are probably more effective when you're not wearing flannel pants with cartoon cats on them. As she turned to go inside, she paused and looked back at me. Thank you for talking me off the ledge. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up when you did. You would have figured it out, I said. Maybe it would have taken a little longer, but you would have gotten there. The rest of that day, I found myself distracted during meetings, wondering how Rebecca was handling the crisis. I texted her around lunch to check in, and she responded that she had made several productive phone calls and was working on updating her portfolio website. Her tone was businesslike but optimistic, and I felt relief that she seemed to be channeling her energy constructively. That evening, I was surprised to see Rebecca in her backyard again, not working in the garden this time, but sitting on a blanket, with her laptop surrounded by papers and notebooks. The late afternoon sun created a golden glow around her, and she looked focused but peaceful. Outdoor office? I called over the fence. She looked up and grinned. The Wi-Fi reaches out here, and I needed some fresh air after being inside all day. Plus, I wanted to check on my seedlings while I worked. How did the phone calls go? Better than expected, actually. One of my clients referred me to their sister organization, and they want to schedule a consultation next week. And I discovered that another client has been wanting to expand their program, but didn't think they could afford additional consulting. Apparently, losing my biggest contract might have been exactly what I needed to push myself to pursue other opportunities. There was something different about the way she spoke now, a confidence that went beyond her earlier determination to rebuild. This setback had tested her resilience, and she had not only survived it, but found a way to transform it into forward momentum. That's fantastic, I said, genuinely impressed by how quickly she had turned the situation around. It got me thinking about something else too, Rebecca said, closing her laptop and giving me her full attention. About taking risks and not letting fear make decisions for me. Something in her tone suggested we were no longer talking exclusively about her career, and I felt my pulse quicken slightly. What kind of risks? I asked. Rebecca stood up, brushing grass off her jeans, and walked closer to the fence that separated our yards. The kind where you ask someone you care about if they want to have dinner with you. Not pizza on the porch or coffee in the kitchen, but an actual date. The kind where you admit that you've been thinking about them more than you probably should, and you want to see if they've been thinking about you too. The words hung between us, clear and honest and brave in a way that took my breath away. Here was Rebecca, who hours earlier had been questioning her ability to succeed at anything, finding the courage to risk rejection in pursuit of something that might be wonderful. Rebecca, I started, but she held up a hand, much as I had done earlier. Before you answer, I need you to know that I understand if this is complicated for you. I know there's an age difference, and I know I come with a lot of baggage. I'm still figuring out who I am as a single person, and I don't have any guarantees about what I can offer someone else. But I also know that I feel happier and more like myself when I'm with you than I have in years. The vulnerability in her confession was stunning. But so was the strength it took to voice it. This wasn't the uncertain woman who had asked whether someone her age could find love again. This was someone who had decided to pursue love actively, despite all the reasons it might not work out. "I've been thinking about you too," I said, and watched relief flood her features. "More than I probably should, considering we're neighbors and complications could get messy." "But," she prompted, clearly hearing the unfinished thought in my voice. "But I can't think of a single good reason why we shouldn't find out what this could be." The smile that spread across Rebecca's face was radiant, transforming her entire appearance from worried to joyful in an instant. "So that's a yes to dinner?" "That's a yes to dinner," I confirmed, "though I think I should probably take you somewhere nicer than the pizza place we've been ordering from." "Actually," Rebecca said, her eyes sparkling with mischief, "I was thinking I could cook for you. I've been wanting to try out some recipes I found, and it might be nice to have our first official date somewhere we can actually talk without worrying about other people overhearing our conversation." The idea of an intimate dinner at her house, just the two of us with no distractions, sounded both thrilling and terrifying. It would be impossible to hide behind casual conversation or pretend this was anything other than what it was. Two people exploring the possibility of something real. "What can I bring?" I asked. "Just yourself," she said, "and maybe your appetite for adventure. I found this recipe for chicken with pomegranate molasses that looks either amazing or like a complete disaster. You might be taking your life in your hands. I think I can handle a little culinary risk-taking." As we finalized plans for Saturday evening, I realized that our conversation had shifted something fundamental between us. We were no longer dancing around possibilities or pretending that our growing connection was purely platonic. We had acknowledged what was happening and decided to pursue it deliberately, which felt both exciting and slightly overwhelming. Friday passed in a blur of anticipation and second-guessing. I found myself paying unusual attention to details I normally ignored, whether my shirts were wrinkled, if I needed a haircut, what wine would pair well with chicken and pomegranate molasses. By Friday evening, I was questioning whether I was ready for what felt like a significant step forward in whatever was developing between Rebecca and me. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered the courage she had shown in asking me out, the way she had faced her professional setback and transformed it into an opportunity for growth. If Rebecca could risk rejection and embrace uncertainty in pursuit of something meaningful, surely I could do the same. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of perfect spring weather that made everything seem possible. I walked the short distance to Rebecca's front door carrying a bottle of wine and a small bouquet of flowers from her favorite garden center. Nothing too elaborate, but something that acknowledged the specialness of the occasion. Rebecca answered, the door wearing a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way I had never seen before. She looked beautiful, but more than that, she looked happy and confident and ready for whatever the evening might bring. "You look stunning," I said, and meant it completely. "Thank you," she replied, accepting the flowers with obvious pleasure. "You clean up pretty well yourself. Come in. Dinner should be ready in about 10 minutes. Her house smelled incredible, filled with the warm scents of herbs and spices that promised the evening would be memorable regardless of how the conversation went. But as Rebecca led me into her kitchen, chattering about the cooking process and her minor panic when she couldn't find pomegranate molasses at the first grocery store, I realized that the conversation was the least of my concerns. The real question was whether I was prepared for the possibility that this evening might change everything between us, and whether I was brave enough to let it. The dinner was extraordinary, not just because the chicken with pomegranate molasses turned out to be a revelation of sweet and tangy flavors, but because everything about the evening felt effortless in a way that surprised both of us. We talked through 3 courses and 2 bottles of wine, covering topics that ranged from our most embarrassing childhood memories to our deepest fears about the future. By the time we moved to the living room with coffee and the dark chocolate, tart Rebecca had somehow managed to make from scratch. It felt like we had known each other for years rather than weeks. "I have a confession," Rebecca said as we settled onto her couch, careful to maintain the kind of respectful distance that acknowledged we were still figuring out the boundaries of whatever this was becoming. "Should I be worried?" I asked, though Her tone suggested something lighthearted rather than serious. I've been practicing this meal for 3 days. I made the chicken recipe twice this week, testing different spice combinations. I wanted everything to be perfect. The admission was so endearingly honest that it made me smile. And here I thought you were just naturally gifted at Mediterranean cuisine. Hardly. I burned the first attempt so badly that I had to open every window in the house to get rid of the smoke. Mrs. Patterson from next door actually came over to check if I needed the fire department. We both laughed, and I realized that Rebecca's willingness to share her vulnerabilities, her cooking disasters, her professional anxieties, her fears about dating again, was one of the things I found most attractive about her. In a world where people often presented carefully curated versions of themselves, especially in the early stages of romance, her authenticity was both refreshing and magnetic. "Can I ask you something?" Rebecca said, and I recognized the phrase that had become our signal for deeper conversation. Always. "What changed your mind? About us, I mean. A month ago, if someone had told you that you'd be having dinner with your 54-year-old neighbor and thinking about what comes next, what would you have said?" It was a fair question, and one I had been asking myself. Honestly, I probably would have said it sounded unlikely, not because of your age specifically, but because I've spent the last couple of years convinced that I wasn't ready for anything serious with anyone. And now, I considered how to articulate something I was still trying to understand myself. Now I think maybe I wasn't ready for anything serious with the wrong person. But being with you doesn't feel serious in the way that used to scare me. It feels natural, like something I want to explore rather than something I should do. Rebecca nodded slowly, as if my words were confirming something she had been thinking. "I know what you mean. With David, even in the beginning, everything felt like work. Good work, important work, but still something that required constant effort and negotiation. This feels different, easier. Does that worry you?" I asked, curious about whether the ease between us felt like a red flag to someone who had spent nearly 3 decades in a difficult marriage. "It terrifies me," she said without hesitation. "But not because I think it's wrong. Because I think it's right, and I'm not sure I trust my judgment about what's right anymore." The honesty in her voice made something tighten in my chest. Here was someone who had been so thoroughly undermined by her previous relationship that she questioned even positive experiences. It made me want to prove to her that not all connections came with hidden costs or ulterior motives. "What would help you trust your judgment?" I asked. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands as she thought. "Time, I think. And evidence that this isn't just some midlife crisis masquerading as romance. I need to know that what I'm feeling is based on who you actually are, not just on relief at feeling wanted again." Her self-awareness was remarkable, and it made me respect her even more. She wasn't rushing headlong into something new just to escape something old. She was approaching this potential relationship with the kind of thoughtful consideration that suggested she had learned valuable lessons from her past. "I can give you time," I said. "And I hope I can give you evidence that this is real." "What about you?" she asked. "What do you need?" The question caught me off guard, partly because no one had ever asked me so directly what I needed from a relationship, and partly because I wasn't sure I had ever thought about it in such clear terms. "I think I need to know that we can grow together without losing ourselves in the process," I said finally. "I've watched too many couples become so focused on being a unit that they forget to be individuals. I want to build something with you, but I also want us both to keep becoming who we're meant to be." Rebecca smiled, and it was the kind of smile that suggested I had said something important. I like that. The idea that love can be something that helps you become more yourself rather than less. As the evening wound down, neither of us seemed eager to end what had been an extraordinary first date. We moved our conversation to Rebecca's front porch, where we could sit on the swing she'd installed the previous week, and watch the neighborhood settle into quiet evening routines. The spring air was warm and fragrant with the scent of blooming trees, and the whole world felt full of possibilities. "I should probably head home," I said eventually, though I made no move to get up from the swing. "You should," Rebecca agreed, equally motionless. "We both have early mornings tomorrow." Another few minutes passed in comfortable silence before Rebecca turned to face me more directly. "Before you go, I want you to know that tonight was perfect. Not just the dinner, but all of it. The conversation, the ease, the way it felt like we were exactly where we were supposed to be. It did feel like that, I agreed. I haven't felt that way in a very long time, maybe ever. The confession hung between us, vulnerable and beautiful, and I found myself leaning closer to her without conscious thought. Rebecca's eyes met mine, and for a moment the whole world narrowed to just the two of us on that porch swing, surrounded by spring air and possibility. When I kissed her, it was soft and tentative at first, a question rather than a statement. But when she kissed me back, it was with a warmth and certainty that answered every doubt I had harbored about whether this connection was mutual. It was a perfect first kiss. Gentle but passionate. Familiar but exciting. Full of promise for what might come next. When we separated, Rebecca's cheeks were flushed, and her eyes were bright with something that looked like wonder. "That was worth waiting for," she said softly. "Definitely worth waiting for," I agreed. This time, when I said I should go home, we both meant it, though the separation felt bittersweet rather than disappointing. We had crossed a threshold, and there was something to be said for savoring the moment rather than rushing toward whatever came next. The following week brought a new rhythm to our relationship. We were officially dating now, which meant our interactions carried a different weight and intention. Rebecca invited me to a gallery opening featuring local artists, and I took her to a concert by a folk musician whose work I thought she might appreciate. We were learning each other's tastes and preferences, discovering compatibility in unexpected areas and charming differences in others. But we were also learning to navigate the peculiar challenges of dating someone who lived 20 feet away. There was no natural pause between encounters, no built-in space to process experiences and miss each other. Every morning, we saw each other collecting mail or leaving for work. Every evening, we could see lights in each other's windows, creating a constant awareness of proximity that was both comforting and occasionally overwhelming. "This is either the most convenient relationship in the world or a recipe for disaster," Rebecca said one evening as we stood in my backyard, able to see directly into her kitchen where she had left the lights on after dinner. "Maybe both," I admitted. "But I'm willing to find out which." The real test came the following Saturday, when Rebecca's daughter unexpectedly announced she was driving up from Austin to visit. Emma was 26, recently graduated from law school, and according to Rebecca, still processing her parents' divorce with the kind of protective anger that made her suspicious of anyone new in her mother's life. "She doesn't know about you yet," Rebecca confessed on Friday evening, clearly anxious about the upcoming visit. I wasn't sure how to explain that I'm dating someone, especially someone who's closer to her age than to mine. The age difference, which had rarely felt significant in our day-to-day interactions, suddenly loomed large in the context of family dynamics. I realized that dating Rebecca meant potentially becoming part of a complex family situation, where my presence might be seen as threatening or inappropriate. "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I can make myself scarce this weekend if that would be easier." "No," Rebecca said quickly. "I want her to meet you. I want her to see that I'm happy and that you're a good person. I just don't know how to have that conversation." "Maybe you don't have to have it all at once," I suggested. "Maybe I just happen to be the neighbor who's helping you with something when she arrives, and we see how things go from there." Rebecca looked relieved at the suggestion. "That might work. Low pressure, no big announcements, just let her get to know you as a person before she has to process you as her mother's boyfriend." Saturday morning arrived with Emma's dramatic entrance into the neighborhood. She drove a bright red convertible that announced her presence from 2 blocks away, and when she climbed out of the car, I could see immediately where Rebecca's determination and strength had come from. Emma was tall and confident, with her mother's warm brown eyes and an air of professional competence that suggested she was going to be a formidable attorney. I watched from my kitchen window as mother and daughter embraced on the front lawn, noting the genuine affection between them, despite whatever tensions might exist around Rebecca's new life. Emma was animated and expressive, gesturing enthusiastically as she told some story that made Rebecca laugh in a way I hadn't seen before. The particular kind of laughter that came from being around someone who had known you since birth. An hour later, Rebecca appeared at my back door with Emma in tow. "Emma, this is my neighbor I was telling you about. He's been helping me with various house projects." The introduction was perfectly casual. But I could see the sharp intelligence in Emma's eyes as she assessed me. She was clearly someone who missed very little and would draw her own conclusions regardless of how carefully her mother framed the situation. "Nice to meet you," Emma said, offering a firm handshake. "Mom mentioned that someone helped her build that garden bed. Impressive work for a beginner." "Your mother is a quick learner," I replied, "and very determined when she sets her mind to something." "That's definitely true," Emma said, and I caught the subtle emphasis that suggested she was talking about more than gardening. The three of us spent the afternoon working on various outdoor projects, weeding Rebecca's flower beds, repairing a loose board on her front steps, and organizing her garage. Emma proved to be as handy as she was intelligent, and I found myself genuinely enjoying her company. She had inherited her mother's directness, but combined it with a dry sense of humor that kept our work entertaining. More importantly, I could see Emma gradually relaxing around me as the day progressed. Whatever defensive stance she had started with was softening as she observed the easy dynamic between Rebecca and me, the way we worked together without needing to discuss who would do what, the comfortable silences and shared glances that spoke to genuine compatibility. By evening, when we were all sitting on Rebecca's porch sharing takeout from the Thai restaurant Rebecca and I had become fond of, the conversation had moved to more personal territory. Emma was telling stories about law school, her new job at a firm in Austin, and her complicated relationship with her father, who apparently was struggling with his own adjustment to post-divorce life. "He keeps calling to ask my opinion about his girlfriend's decorating choices," Emma said, rolling her eyes. "As if I want to be involved in his midlife crisis interior design decisions. I told him he's going to have to figure out his new life without using me as a sounding board." "That must be difficult," I said carefully, aware that I was treading on sensitive ground. "It is," Emma admitted. "But not for the reasons you might think. I'm not upset that he's dating someone new. I'm upset that he seems to need my approval for every decision he makes, as if he can't trust his own judgment anymore." Rebecca and I exchanged a glance, both recognizing the complexity of Emma's position as the adult child of divorced parents, who were both rebuilding their lives in different ways. "For what it's worth," Emma continued, looking directly at her mother, "you seem happier than you have in years, more like yourself. And that's something I haven't seen in a long time." The simple statement carried more weight than any elaborate declaration of approval could have. Emma wasn't just accepting her mother's new relationship. She was recognizing that it was good for Rebecca in ways that went beyond romance. As the evening wound down and Emma prepared to drive back to Austin the next morning, she pulled me aside while Rebecca was inside preparing coffee. "I don't know what your intentions are with my mother," she said quietly, "but I want you to know that she's been through enough disappointment for one lifetime. If you're not serious about this, please be honest about that sooner rather than later." The protective edge in her voice reminded me that Emma was a lawyer, someone trained to anticipate problems and advocate for her clients. In this case, her client was her mother's well-being. "I understand," I said, "and I want you to know that your mother's happiness matters to me. I'm not interested in causing her any more pain." Emma studied my face for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Because she deserves someone who appreciates what an extraordinary person she is." As Emma drove away the next morning, Rebecca and I stood in her driveway waving goodbye, and I realized that we had passed an important test. Emma's visit had forced us to consider our relationship in the context of family dynamics and long-term implications, and we had emerged with a stronger sense of both the possibilities and the responsibilities involved in what we were building together. 2 months into our relationship, the comfortable rhythm Rebecca and I had established was disrupted by an unexpected phone call that arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my home office. The caller ID showed my mother's number, which immediately put me on alert since she rarely called during business hours unless something was wrong. "Michael," she said without preamble, "your father and I are driving through Texas next week on our way to visit your aunt in New Mexico. We'd like to stop and see you for a few days." My parents lived in Oregon and made this cross-country trip once a year, but they had never included a stop in my small Texas town. The timing felt deliberate rather than coincidental, and I suspected my sister had been sharing updates about my life that had piqued their curiosity. "Of course," I said, though my mind was already racing through the implications. "How long are you thinking of staying?" 3 days, maybe 4. We want to see your house, meet some of your friends, get a sense of how you're settling into the community. The emphasis on friends was subtle but unmistakable. My family had always been curious about my personal life, but they had learned to stop asking direct questions after years of vague responses about my dating situation. Now, apparently, they had heard enough secondhand information to warrant an investigation. After finalizing the logistics of their visit, I walked over to Rebecca's house to share the news. I found her in her back garden, harvesting herbs for the pasta sauce she was planning to make for dinner. The garden had transformed dramatically over the past few weeks, evolving from tentative seedlings into a lush collection of vegetables and herbs that proved Rebecca's nurturing abilities extended far beyond her professional consulting work. My parents are coming to visit next week, I announced without preamble. Rebecca looked up from the basil plants, immediately reading the concern in my voice. That's wonderful, isn't it? It should be, but I think they're coming specifically to meet you. How do you know that? I explained about the unusual timing of their visit and the pointed references to meeting my friends. Rebecca listened thoughtfully, continuing to snip herbs as she processed the information. Are you worried about their reaction? She asked finally. The question forced me to examine feelings I hadn't fully acknowledged. I'm worried about putting you in an uncomfortable position. My parents are good people, but they have very traditional ideas about relationships and life, timelines. They've been waiting for me to settle down with someone appropriate for over a decade. And I'm not appropriate? You're perfect, I said quickly. But you're also divorced, older than me, and rebuilding your life after a major transition. Those aren't necessarily things my parents would immediately see as positives. Rebecca set down her herb scissors and gave me her full attention. What are you really worried about, Michael? Her directness, as always, cut through my diplomatic explanations to the heart of the matter. I'm worried that they'll make you feel like you have to prove yourself worthy of their son. And I'm worried that their reaction might make you question whether this relationship is worth the complications it might create. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, considering my concerns with the thoughtful seriousness she brought to important conversations. Do you want me to meet them? Yes, I said without hesitation. I want them to see how happy you make me, and I want them to understand that what we have is real and valuable. Then we'll figure it out together, she said simply. But I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't try to manage their reaction or mine. Don't spend the visit worrying about whether everyone is getting along perfectly. Just be yourself, and let the rest of us be ourselves too. Her practical approach to what I had been building up as a potentially catastrophic situation was both reassuring and humbling. Rebecca had already proven she could handle difficult family dynamics with grace and authenticity. I needed to trust that those same qualities would serve her well with my parents. The week leading up to their arrival was filled with the kind of nervous preparation that revealed how much this meeting mattered to both of us. Rebecca spent extra time on her garden and her house, not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because she wanted to feel confident in her own space. I found myself cleaning my house more thoroughly than I had since moving in, as if spotless baseboards would somehow communicate my happiness and stability more effectively than conversation. My parents arrived on a Thursday afternoon, driving the same silver sedan they had owned for 8 years and packed with the methodical efficiency that characterized all their travels. My mother emerged from the passenger seat wearing a carefully coordinated outfit that managed to look both comfortable and presentable, while my father began unloading luggage with the systematic approach he brought to all practical tasks. The house looks wonderful, my mother said after we had completed the initial round of greetings and tours. Very well maintained, and the neighborhood seems lovely and quiet. Her approval was genuine, but I could sense her cataloging details that would become part of later conversations about my lifestyle and choices. My parents were both retired teachers, people who had spent their careers observing and assessing, and they applied those same analytical skills to personal relationships. I thought we could have dinner at that Italian place downtown tonight, I suggested, and tomorrow I could show you around some of the local attractions. That sounds perfect, my father said. Though your sister mentioned you've been spending time with one of your neighbors, we'd love to meet her if the opportunity arises. The casual mention of Rebecca confirmed my suspicions about the purpose of their visit, but it also opened the door for a natural introduction, rather than an awkward, forced meeting. Actually, she's right next door, I said. Rebecca's been incredibly welcoming since I moved here. I'm sure she'd enjoy meeting you." That evening, after dinner at the Italian restaurant where my parents charmed the waitress and declared the food surprisingly authentic for a small Texas town, we returned to my house to find Rebecca working in her front yard. She was replanting some annuals that had been damaged in a recent storm, her hands covered in garden soil and her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Perfect timing," I said, leading my parents over to make introductions. Rebecca stood up, wiping her hands on a towel she had brought outside for exactly this purpose, and extended a clean hand to my mother. "You must be Michael's parents. I'm Rebecca Martinez. Welcome to the neighborhood." The greeting was warm but not overly familiar, striking exactly the right tone for a first meeting. My mother responded with genuine friendliness, and my father immediately began asking questions about Rebecca's garden, which he had been admiring from across the yard. "Your tomatoes are impressive for this early in the season," he said. "What variety are you growing?" This led to a 15-minute discussion about heirloom varieties, soil composition, and organic pest control methods that revealed my father's own passion for gardening and Rebecca's growing expertise. My mother, meanwhile, was taking in details about Rebecca's house, her manner of speaking, and the easy way she interacted with both of my parents. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" Rebecca offered as the gardening conversation wound down. "I just made a peach cobbler this afternoon, and I always end up with more than I can eat myself." The invitation was perfectly pitched, casual, enough not to seem presumptuous, but warm enough to suggest genuine hospitality. My parents accepted with obvious pleasure, and we spent the next 2 hours in Rebecca's living room, engaged in the kind of wide-ranging conversation that revealed character and compatibility. Rebecca talked about her consulting work, carefully, explaining her expertise without seeming to boast about her achievements. She mentioned her daughter Emma and her pride in her daughter's legal career. She answered questions about her divorce with honesty, but without bitterness, presenting it as a difficult but ultimately positive life change rather than a personal failure. More importantly, she demonstrated the qualities that had drawn me to her in the first place: her thoughtfulness, her humor, her ability to listen with genuine interest and contribute meaningfully to any discussion. By the time we said goodnight, my parents were clearly charmed. "She's lovely," my mother said, as we walked back to my house. "Very intelligent and accomplished, and she obviously cares about you." "What makes you say that?" I asked, curious about what signals my mother had picked up. "The way she looks at you when you're talking, the way she includes you in conversations without dominating them, the way she made sure you were comfortable during the entire visit." My father nodded in agreement. "She seems like someone who understands how to be in a partnership without losing herself in it. That's a rare quality." The next day, my parents met Rebecca again when she joined us for lunch at a local cafe that featured farm-to-table cuisine and outdoor seating overlooking a small lake. This second meeting was more relaxed, with conversation flowing easily between topics that revealed shared interests and compatible perspectives on everything from travel to books to current events. "Have you traveled much internationally?" my mother asked Rebecca as we waited for our entrees to arrive. "Not as much as I'd like," Rebecca replied. "David wasn't interested in traveling to places where he couldn't play golf, so most of our trips were to resort destinations. But I've always wanted to see more of Europe, particularly the smaller towns and countryside areas." "Michael spent a semester in Italy during college," my father said. "He's been talking about going back ever since." "Really?" Rebecca turned to me with obvious interest. "What part of Italy?" This led to a discussion about travel dreams and plans that revealed both Rebecca's curiosity about the world and her openness to new experiences. I found myself imagining future trips we might take together, wondering if my parents were having the same thoughts about their son's potential future. The real test came that evening, when Rebecca invited all of us to her house for dinner. She had spent the afternoon preparing what she described as a simple meal, but when we arrived, it was clear that considerable thought and effort had gone into every detail. The table was set with care, the food was restaurant quality, and the atmosphere was warm and welcoming without being overly formal. During dinner, the conversation turned to more personal topics. My parents shared stories about their own courtship and early marriage, tales I had heard countless times, but which took on new significance in the context of introducing Rebecca to family history and traditions. We met in college, my mother explained. But we didn't start dating until after graduation, when we both ended up teaching in the same school district. Everyone thought we were too young to get married, but we knew what we wanted. How did you know? Rebecca asked, and I could hear genuine curiosity rather than polite interest in her voice. We brought out the best in each other, my father said. We were both better people together than we were separately, and we wanted the same things from life: a stable home, children, meaningful work, the chance to build something lasting. That's beautiful, Rebecca said. It's wonderful when people find that kind of compatibility early and can build a life around it. There was something wistful in her tone that suggested she was thinking about her own first marriage and the different trajectory it had taken. But there was also something hopeful, as if she was considering the possibility that meaningful partnership could be found more than once in a lifetime. After dinner, we moved to Rebecca's back porch, where the conversation continued as the sun set and the evening air filled with the sounds of a neighborhood settling into quietness. My parents asked Rebecca about her future plans, her hopes for her consulting business, her relationship with her daughter. Emma seems like a remarkable young woman, my mother observed. You must be very proud. I am, Rebecca said. She's accomplished things I never dreamed of at her age. But more than that, she's become someone I genuinely enjoy spending time with. That's not always a given with parent-child relationships. How does she feel about your new life? My father asked gently. Divorce can be difficult for adult children, too. She's been incredibly supportive, Rebecca replied. I think she saw how unhappy I was in my marriage, even when I was trying to hide it. She wants me to find happiness, even if it looks different than she expected. As the evening wound down, I walked my parents back to my house while Rebecca stayed behind to clean up. The short walk gave us a chance to debrief the evening without the pressure of immediate reactions. So, I said, what do you think? My mother smiled. I think she's wonderful. More than that, I think you're wonderful together. There's an ease between you that suggests real compatibility. She's obviously been through some difficult times, my father added, but she's handled them with grace and strength. Those are qualities that will serve her well in any relationship. Are you concerned about the age difference? I asked directly. My parents exchanged a glance before my mother answered. Initially, we might have been, but after spending time with both of you, it's clear that you're well matched in terms of maturity and life goals. Age is just one factor among many. Besides, my father said with a slight smile, 16 years isn't that significant when you're talking about two adults who know what they want from life. Their acceptance was more complete and immediate than I had dared to hope. More importantly, it was based on genuine observation, rather than politeness or wishful thinking. They had seen Rebecca as she really was, and appreciated her qualities, without reservation. The following morning, as my parents prepared to continue their journey to New Mexico, Rebecca came over to say goodbye. She hugged both of them warmly and invited them to visit again any time, an invitation they accepted with obvious pleasure. Take care of our son, my mother said as they embraced. He takes pretty good care of himself, Rebecca replied, but I'll do my best to support him in that. After my parents drove away, Rebecca and I stood in my driveway, processing the success of the visit and what it meant for our relationship going forward. That went well, Rebecca said with obvious relief. Better than well, I agreed. They genuinely like you, and more importantly, they can see that we're good together. I was nervous, Rebecca admitted. I wanted them to approve, not just for your sake, but because family relationships matter. I didn't want to be the person who complicated your connection with your parents. You could never be that person, I said, pulling her closer. If anything, I think you've given them peace of mind about my happiness. As we walked back toward Rebecca's house, I realized that my parents' visit had accomplished something important, beyond their approval of our relationship. It had forced both Rebecca and me to articulate our feelings and intentions more clearly, to present ourselves as a couple with shared values and compatible goals. In preparing for their scrutiny, we had examined our own foundation and found it solid. We had passed another test, and in doing so, had moved closer to understanding that what we were building together was strong enough to withstand external challenges and worthy of the investment we were both making in its future. 8 months later, Rebecca received a call that changed everything. A major consulting firm in Denver offered her a dream position, leading fundraising operations for environmental nonprofits, with a salary triple what she had been earning. "It's incredible," she told me that evening, contract details spread across her kitchen table. "But it means leaving here, leaving you." The decision deadline was 2 weeks. Neither of us slept well that night, both staring at the ceiling, thinking about uncertain futures. "What if I came with you?" I suggested the next evening. Rebecca looked surprised. "You would do that?" "My work is remote." "And you're my future," I said simply. "The house is just a building. What we have together is irreplaceable." After a week of soul-searching, Rebecca accepted the position. I resigned from my local contracts to join her in Colorado. Mrs. Patterson declared it the most romantic thing she'd witnessed in 40 years. Emma drove up from Austin to help pack and interrogate me about my commitment level. "You're really following my mother across the country," Emma said as we loaded boxes. "I'm really building a life with your mother. The location is just a detail." Emma smiled. "Good answer." 6 months later, we were settled in Denver's Capitol Hill neighborhood. Rebecca thrived in her new position while I built a Colorado client base. The adjustment tested us. We argued about kitchen organization and social calendars, but we emerged stronger. On a spring evening in our small backyard garden, Rebecca turned to me with important news. "Jennifer offered me a permanent partnership. Today," she said. "But accepting means committing to Denver long-term. I wanted to make sure that's what we both want." I took her hands, noting the gardening calluses and the confidence in her posture that spoke to her growth. "Rebecca Martinez, I followed you here because I love you. I would follow you anywhere and build a permanent life wherever your dreams take you. Even if I'm 55 and still starting over?" "Especially because you're 55 and still starting over. You're brave enough to keep growing, and I want to grow alongside you." She kissed me then, soft and sure, full of promises about our future. As the sun set behind the mountains, I realized Rebecca's original question had been answered through actions, not words. Yes, I would absolutely date someone who was 54 and starting over. In fact, I had fallen completely in love with her. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.